Hi guys, so for today's project, I have a shirt that a client gave me that she was never able to wear because she ironed it the first time and it melted the back of the fabric. So that'll happen sometimes with synthetics. This is a polyester satin fabric, and it, instead of burning, usually natural fibers burn, but synthetic fibers melt. So if you can see, it kind of just melted a hole into the back here, but it's kind of the upper back. So what I'm going to do is make a yoke, insert a lace fabric, since it was kind of be hard to find something that would look nice with this stripe if it wasn't the exact right color, and I think that just plain white would have been boring. So I'm going to put in a white lace to make it look like it was done on purpose. And so I'll show you how to do something like that today. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to mark off where I want to place the seams for my back yoke. So I drew this little picture here so you can see kind of like what I want it to look like with the lace in the back. And it's going to have a V at the bottom, and then I'm going to leave a little bit of the lace at the top here. So I'm going to take my tape. Now you can use sewing chalk if you want. I'm going to use that later when I draw the cut. But I'm just going to use this tape to mark first. Now this is dress form tape, and I got it in the garment district in New York. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon, or you can just use like skinny masking tape, anything that's gonna just come off. It's just to mark where you want it. And you can do this flat if you want, if you don't have a form too. It's easier for me to see where it is on the body. Make sure you try it on yourself, because I don't, like around where the bra sits right here, I want to make sure that the bra won't be showing. So I'm keeping in mind that I'm going to have half an inch seam allowance when I'm sewing. So I'm going to just make sure, I don't want to make it super low, but I want to make sure I give myself like the half-inch space for the seam allowance. So I'm kind of marking this, the top line of the tape is where I'm imagining my seam is going to be. So I'm going to cut that off there, and make sure you're also keeping in mind if you need to mark it. Now this one has a seam in the back collar, so I can see where the center back is, but you might need to mark where the center back is if you're doing something that's not just straight across, so that way you know that it's in the center, because you wouldn't want a point that's like, when you try it on, all of a sudden it's a little bit over to one side. That would look weird, unless it's intentional and you want it to be an asymmetrical look. Okay, so I have the one side, and I'm just gonna measure to do the other side, how far down on the armhole it is. So about 6 inches from the shoulder. And 6 inches. Right there. Okay, next I'm going to put my next yoke line. Now I'm going to do a seam across here because I don't want to have to do around the neck and the shoulder and everything. I don't want it to be that exposed. So I'm going to leave some of the fabric up here, and it also just makes it a little bit easier, because it'll be easier to sew a straight line than it will be to sew around the shoulder and the neckline and everything. Always measure to make sure it's even. Okay, so that's what, this is going to be my insert here. So I can perfect this a little bit when I lay it flat, but this is just kind of a good way to get a nice visual of what it's going to look like when it's on somebody. Okay, now that it's flat, I can measure out and make sure everything is even. So this is about 2 1/4. 2 1/2. Now this top line, I just want to make sure it's straight. Now that I know I want it to be 3 1/2 inches up from this line, I'm just going to mark it with chalk. Now, even though the chalk is washable, I wouldn't use like this is light fabric, so I wouldn't use like a really deep color. It's supposed to wash off, but I don't trust anything, so I think that you have a better chance with it coming off if you use a light color on top of it. So I'm just going to use this yellow. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where I'm going to cut the fabric. Because so now you can see that I'm going to cut the fabric out within this space. This is where I want the seams to be, but I need to leave 1/2 inch for seam allowance. Because if I cut where I want the seams to be, there's nothing to sew it to. So I need to leave 1/2 inch within here, and I'm going to leave 1/2 inch within this. There's like a binding on here, so I'm going to leave 1/2 inch within the armhole because I don't really want to have to deal with finishing that off. So I'm going to leave 1/2 inch around the armhole, and I'll leave 1/2 inch around here, and I'm just going to cut out that middle part. So I'm going to draw where I'm going to cut out. So I want this to be a straight seam. The nice thing about this stripe is that I can see if it's at a right angle with the stripes, if the fabric is lined up properly, because sometimes the fabric, this fabric especially, since it's a satin fabric, it's really slippery. This is one of these things I feel like sometimes when you're sewing and pattern making, you really could use like 4 hands. Oh, see? Just pulled out there. Okay, so now that's my sewing line. I'm really just doing this lightly since it's such a slippery fabric. it looks like I did a really good job of eyeballing a 1/2 inch there. Okay, so now I have my lines drawn. Now I'm not going to draw the lines here. Let's just check. Because I'm really good at eyeballing 1/2 inch. So I don't know if I feel like tracing that on here. So I'm just going to eyeball it myself. So now the portion that I cut out, I'm going to use to make the pattern for the lace. So you want to make sure that you cut it out so that it's intact. So what I'm actually going to do, since it breaks off there, is I'm going to take my tape and I'm just going to go like this so that, and I'm going to do it to the other side. So that when I cut it, I just kind of know, where it's like a full piece for the pattern. Okay, so I have all my lines traced with the seam allowance. So next thing I'm going to do is cut it. And this is what my pattern piece will look like. Almost. So next I'm going to put down a piece of paper and I'll make the pattern piece for the lace. Oh no, you can use any paper. This is pattern making paper that I got in New York. So it's nice that it has these little grid on it. But you can use any paper that you have that will fit your pattern piece. Whenever you have straight lines, just start with a straight line. So this one is supposed to be a straight line. So I'm going to match that up there. And then I'm just going to lightly trace. This is a really flimsy fabric. It's kind of hard to do a really good tracing. But I'm going to lightly trace where it is. And then I can fix it up. Okay, so next I'm just going to fix up my lines. Okay, so here's the basic shape for the yoke. Now, remember we cut away 1/2 inch to make the seam allowance on the shirt? Well, we need to add that 1/2 inch back to this, or else this will be too small. But then we also need to have 1/2 inch seam allowance to the lace. So it means we have to add 1 inch all the way around because we're adding in the 1/2 inch that we cut out because we left a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the top. And then there's another 1/2 inch seam allowance on the lace as it is. So I hope that makes sense. If anybody has any questions about that, please feel free to let me know. So I'm going to add 1 inch all the way around. Oops. Okay. I'm going to check if this is symmetrical. I didn't really feel like it because I was a little bit nervous that it wasn't going to be. But, let's see, that's 12, so about 6 inches. That's not too bad. Next, I'm just going to cut out my piece. Okay. Now I'm ready to cut out my lace. Okay, so there's my piece, and I'm going to have the lace in right there. The first seam I'm going to sew is going to be this one because the point is the hardest part. Notice the way that I'm pinning with the little ball part sticking out here, because if you stick it in this way as you're sewing and it's going through the machine, it's really hard to kind of grab it while you're holding the fabric that way. But if it's out like this, it's really easy to just, as it's going through the machine, to just pull it out by the side. Okay. Get one side pinned. Always just test out your machine to see how it's working, because sometimes I feel like these things have PMS or something and they decide just not to sew a normal seam on all of your normal settings. Okay. So now I'm not starting all the way from the edge of the armhole. I'm going to start about half an inch in because I want to give myself a little room to play in the corners. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So like this is where I'm going to sew, but instead of starting all the way out here at the armhole, I'm going to sew about starting a little bit where that armhole seam allowance is going to start, because I'm going to need to put slashes in the corners, but I don't want to do that until I know what the seam looks like. So I'll show you what that looks like when I do it. Okay, now do the same thing at the other end. So I started about half an inch away from the lace because it's going to have to go up to the next side where it curves up, and I want to make sure I get that point right. Doing a point like that in sewing is one of the harder things. Okay, so now what you're going to do, I'll show you with the slashes. See, I have this point here. That's the bottom. So I'm going to take my scissors. There's a little piece of tape stuck to there. So I'm going to take my scissors and slash down in the point. You only want to do like I did it, like 3/7 inch. Because it's a half inch seam allowance and I don't want to cut into where the seam is going to be, or else there's going to be cut fabric showing from the outside. You're going to knead it so that it opens like that here. So this is the corner. And then this little slit is just going to open to make room for the point. So let me pin it and I'll show you. See, I have it pinned. So you just need it. It's going to need a little bit of an opening there on the point. And then you can sew the other side. Okay, see, show you. It's a little puckery, but I think that I might be able to fix that with ironing, because when I flip it over, it's not too bad. It's still a V, so when I press it, I think it'll be nice. So I'm going to go press it and see what it looks like now. It's not so bad. And I'm going to finish the inside seam allowances with twill tape, and so there's going to be a top stitch over here, so that'll make it look a little bit nicer and cleaner, as long as my stitching is straight and the machine doesn't mess up. So when you sew the rest of the seams, you just have to do the same kind of thing we did with the corner, except for it was an opposite corner. But on these corners right here and at the bottom, you're gonna have to sew to clip it again in the corner to right where the seam is gonna be, so that way the piece will fit in. So see this bottom corner here? I'm gonna clip it in from the corner to where the seam is gonna be. And then that will allow me to pin it nicely and to sew. So you're gonna do that with the rest of the seams. And so I'm gonna sew up the armhole seams and the top seam. So I'm not gonna lie, sewing these corners is really difficult and kind of a pain in the butt, and it can be a little sloppy. I feel like I kind of pulled it off really okay, but it's a little difficult, and I know everybody's not at the same sewing level, so I totally understand if you're doing something like this and you don't want to leave this little skinny part of the armhole. You could just completely cut it off seams, and then like cut it off straight, like the seam, like the straight seam going straight across, and then at least you can just sew it straight, and then when you're done you just have to finish this edge. So that might be a little bit easier for you because the corners are tricky, and I think sometimes I tend to make things harder on myself. So here's just a little sketch that I put together to show you what the easier option would look like. Now on the left is what I did, and you can see how I left a little bit of the original striped fabric on the side of the armhole, but then you have to sew all those corners. So on the right is the easier option, so you would just have to cut off the fabric straight across at the top, and then the bottom points would go straight out towards the armhole, so you're completely cutting that portion of the armhole out. So you'll just need to trace the armhole when making that pattern to make sure it follows the same shape. And then after you sew it through, it will be easier, but just make sure you're finishing off the lace or whatever your yoke fabric is at the edge there. So anyways, here's what it looks like. It's sewn in. So I'm going to iron it. And when you iron it with the seams facing the fabric, not the lace for this one, because I'm going to attach twill tape to the inside to finish it off because the inside doesn't look great and this fabric will for sure fray. So I'm gonna press it and then I'll show you how to do that next. Okay, so next I have this 1/2 inch twill tape and I'm just gonna use it to cover up the seams on the inside. So what I'm gonna do is I don't want the twill tape showing through the other side on the lace. So I'm gonna sew it so that the seam allowance is going to be underneath. We're gonna have to trim it. But pretty much I'm gonna sew it so that, let me show you. It's going to look like this on the inside. So let's say this is the top of my seam and I'm gonna just have the twill tape over top of it, and it's not gonna be over the lace. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pin it on the underside of the seam, just right next to the edge of the seam. I'm pinning it to the seam allowance. I'm just going to do the top seam first, and then I'm going to do the bottom with the point, and then I'm going to finish the armhole last. Okay, so see I have it sewed to the seam allowance here, so the seam is just right under the twill tape, and I'm going to sew about like 1/8 of an inch in away from the seam. So on top of the twill tape through the seam allowance, I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch in. So see how that is there. Because then what I'm going to do is it's going to fold, I'm going to trim it and it's going to fold up, and I'm going to attach it to the garment so that I get the top stitch on the back, and it's also attaching the seam on the inside and the twill tape. So you'll see. Okay, so you can see the machine here. So I have the seam allowance and the seam here, and I'm sewing it in. I'm sewing the twill tape to it at 1/8 of an inch in from there. So technically, since this is 1/2 inch, you're sewing it in at 3/8 of an inch. So that's how you're attaching the twill tape to the seam allowance. Okay, so now that the twill tape is attached, next I'm going to cut away the seam allowance, not the twill tape, but just cut the seam allowance in half so that it's about 1/4 of an inch or about 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so you can see how the seam allowance is cut down. Okay, so I forgot to record me telling you what to do next, but just continue doing that with the rest of the seams you sewed. So do the top seam, and then I would do the point. Now do the point separately, so do the left side and then the right side, and let one side overlap on the other, and then do the armholes last, and leave a little bit of like 1/2 of an inch extension of twill tape, and I'll show you what that looks like next so you can see how to do it. Now you can see I have the twill tape all sewn in, and you can see where I let the edges hang over. So I sewed in the top and the bottom first, and then I sewed this over top. And now you can see where I have the little parts that hang down further, because I'm going to let this fold over like this so that when I sew it down here, I'm going to fold it like that. I'm going to have to trim them so it's not as bulky, but so that when I sew it here, they get sewn under there. So it's going to look like that. And I'm going to have a stitch. This is going to be the stitch that's going to be a top stitch you're going to see on the outside. So I'm going to sew it here, about 1/8 of an inch in from the twill tape. But I'm probably going to sew it on this side because this is what you're going to see. So I'm going to sew it about, it's going to be 1/8 of an inch away. Yeah, let me see. So about like 1/4 of an inch away from the seam is where I'm going to sew. So I'm just going to make sure it's flipped over the right way. I'm going to press it down and make sure it's sewn there. And then when I sew the armhole section here, see I have it sewed on top of these two portions here, and I let this hang over, and I trimmed everything. So that when I fold it over, I'm going to fold this over with it and under so that everything is going to be like that. And then this one's going to be folded under here. So everything is going to be a clean finish. So there's not going to be anything that frays at all. I'm actually going to press this down first, but then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin it on the outside here since I can stick it on the side. But since I'm going to be sewing it from this side, I'm just going to make sure that when I'm sewing it, the seam allowance is flat and going in on the right side, because I'd rather have it be straight on this side and maybe like a little bit wonky on this side. But this is what everyone is going to be seeing. So I just want to make sure it's going to be straight next to the seam on the outside. Okay, so now you can see how I have it pinned down. So I'm actually just going to sew like along this edge first to get that nailed down. After that, I'm just going to sew the corner. I just pin them under, and I'm going to sew along the edges to make sure it's tacked down the way I want to. So that way when I do sew it to the garment, I don't have to worry about it moving around. So I'm just going to do those seams first. Okay, so now that it's sewn just like this, you can see this one's sewn here to the front. And then I just made sure these are tacked down here, but it's still loose. So I can just trim any of that so it's not too bulky. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over. So now I'm going to sew the stitch that's going to sew the seam down here. So it's going to be about 1/2 inch here. And it's going to be above the seam there and then below the point. So what I'm going to do is that I'm actually going to pin the seam allowance so it lays flat. So then when I'm sewing it across, I don't have to worry about where the seam allowance is. Okay, so I'm just going to pin it in just a few spots. Okay, so there's that seam at the top. Now I guess I could have used, it kind of went in the middle of the twill tape, so I guess I could have used a 3/8 of an inch tape, but I only had the 1/2 of an inch, and I don't want this seam to be way up there. You don't really want a top stitch seam to be more than 1/4 of an inch, because that's kind of awkward looking. So I think this is fine as it is. So I'm just going to go and do the same thing that I did at the top seam with the bottom one. And that's the last step. So the tricky part is just making sure I get a nice clean corner seam. So what I might do is pin it on the inside first so that I can get a nice good pinning on the outside for when I sew it. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and continue pinning the rest of it so that the seam allowance is flat. And then I'm going to sew this one. So now when you sew through here, just make sure you're sewing to the corner. You put the needle down, pick up the presser foot, pivot so that it goes up this way, and then continue sewing. You don't want to stop and back stitch and then start it again, because you don't want to see that back stitching here, because that looks sloppy and it doesn't look very nice. So you sew this down this way here. Once you get to the corner, stop, make sure the needle is in through the fabric, pick up the presser foot, pivot it so that this seam is going the right way. Well, pivot it and then put the presser foot down so that this seam is going the right way, and then continue sewing up to the end, okay? So I'm going to do that next, and that's that step. So there's the final result. Just got some stray threads to trim. But it's not too bad. It got a little sloppy in the corners. Like I said, I think I would just suggest cutting it all the way to the end. Makes it a little bit easier for sewing. But this is the first time I've done this before, so. And then this is the inside, so it's pretty clean. But I think overall it looks pretty good. I'm going to see what it looks like on the form. Okay, so I tried it on my super tall mannequin girl, and I think it looks really cute. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Please subscribe to my channel and follow my posts on my website, sewsiz.com. That's SEWSIZ.com. And follow me on social media. It's Instagram @sewsiz, Facebook page @sewsiz, and Twitter @sew_siz. So thanks for watching.